Tout d'abord, le changement du nom de la monnaie, du franc CFA à l'écho.
This is Alassane Ouattara, the president of Côte d'Ivoire. Next to him is Emmanuel Macron, the president of France. They're shaking hands. But behind that handshake lies a decades-long history of power struggles. France has declared an end to its colonial influence, yet in reality, 14 African countries remain under Paris's control. Especially in terms of currency, all roads still lead to the Élysée Palace. But why? This is Charles de Gaulle, the national hero who liberated France, but also the boogeyman of Paris's former colonies. After successfully driving the fascists out of the hexagon-shaped country, de Gaulle became chairman of the provisional government. At that time, France was a nation ravaged mercilessly by war. With a colonial mindset, de Gaulle knew he had to do something with the colonies to revive French civilization. He rejected all peaceful efforts from Vietnam at the Fontainebleau Conference, plotting instead to reinvade the country in 1946. However, his ambition was crushed by the Vietnamese with their legendary victory at Dien Bien Phu. But halfway around the world, the people of Africa weren't so fortunate. De Gaulle established a common currency for Paris's colonies in the Dark Continent. That currency was the CFA franc. His move was, in fact, rooted in actions taken a century earlier. At this time, the French colonial empire had seized control of all of West and Central Africa. To cement their dominance in every aspect, they imposed the use of the French franc on the region. Their dream of a Paris-subjugated Africa was shining brighter than ever. Unfortunately, World War II shattered that dream. Back to de Gaulle. He rose to power from the ashes that Nazi Germany left. Factories laid in ruins. The national budget hit rock bottom. Public debt was at a record high, and inflation had soared to 150%. Internationally, the Bretton Woods system had come into effect, requiring all currencies to be pegged to the US dollar. The French franc plummeted in value. By late December 1945, $1 could only be exchanged for 119.1 francs, compared to just 49.6 previously. In this context, de Gaulle couldn't simply print more money, yet he still needed to revive national production. The key to all of this lay in Africa. To de Gaulle, the continent remained largely untouched after World War II. Therefore, importing raw materials and exporting French goods there became a perfect strategy for economic recovery. However, the colonial peoples were no longer as obedient as before. After 1945, movements demanding freedom and improved living conditions began to emerge across Africa. These uprisings were actively supported by the two superpowers, the US and the Soviet Union. Facing this situation, de Gaulle decided to offer them a gift: a new currency. On December 26, 1945, de Gaulle signed a decree establishing the CFA franc. France's finance minister, René Pleven, praised the currency as a symbol of France's generosity and selflessness. For we do not wish to impose upon our distant children the consequences of the poverty we ourselves are enduring. De Gaulle's next goal was to set up the operational framework of this currency. He created the Central Fund for the French overseas territories, which held full authority to issue the CFA franc. But that still isn't enough, de Gaulle declared. We must peg this currency to our French franc. As soon as they received the new currency, France's Africans were met with more delighting news. One CFA franc could be exchanged for 1.7 French francs. This exchange rate could only be changed at France's discretion. A strong currency sounded like a luxury for those living in hardship across Africa, but in reality, it served Paris's interests. With the CFA franc, de Gaulle had created a miracle cure for France and handed a slow poison to the African economy. Their only real option was to trade with France, using a currency created and controlled by de Gaulle. In doing so, France gradually regained access to raw materials from Africa, which had declined before 1945. Perhaps it was this masterstroke that led to de Gaulle being officially elected president of France in 1958. Back to the colonial currency. In October 1948, the CFA franc was devalued. Now, it took 2 CFA francs to exchange for 1 French franc. Everything remained as it had been until 1960. The anti-colonial movement erupted globally, stronger than ever. As before, the US and the Soviet Union eagerly supported this wave. This placed immense pressure on de Gaulle and his colonial policies. He had no choice but to grant independence to the fertile African lands. But with that came a new concern. How could France maintain influence over the continent? He came up with a plan to grant conditional independence. De Gaulle declared to France's African colonies, "My dear friends, you now have 2 choices. Either join a community led by me, using the CFA franc, and receive a degree of autonomy, or gain full independence, but lose all financial support from France." The Republic of Guinea boldly chose the second option. That was all de Gaulle needed. He sprang into action. He cut off all financial aid, flooded the economy with counterfeit money, sabotaged the power grid, blocked their UN membership, and even plotted to overthrow President Sékou Touré. The young nation of Guinea couldn't bear the pressure, and so they were forced to join the French-led community. Following this victory, de Gaulle eagerly reorganized the CFA franc system. From then on, the currency would be divided into 2 zones. One for the West African Economic and Monetary Union, and another for the Economic and Monetary Community of Central Africa. Of course, some former colonies had the capacity to completely sever ties with the currency, such as Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. On the other hand, countries like Guinea-Bissau and Equilateral Guinea, though never officially under French rule, still joined the CFA franc bloc. And just like that, de Gaulle had sculpted a monetary union in which France retained the role of Big Brother. Also in 1960, de Gaulle introduced a new French franc. Accordingly, 1 new franc was equal to 100 old francs. This revaluation led to a devaluation of the CFA franc. The CFA franc would be devalued again in 1994. It took 100 CFA francs to equal 1 French franc. In 1999, the CFA franc was pegged to the euro. 1 euro could now be exchanged for nearly 656 CFA francs. This arrangement has continued to the present day. However, contrary to the member countries' hopes for monetary stability, this region has instead received harsh criticism.
These Beninese youths are burning CFA franc banknotes to contest the use of the currency in Africa.
For me, it doesn't matter if we have a currency called CFA. The thing is, this currency, whatever its denomination, the FCFA should be a sovereign currency or a currency whose monetary policy is defined by and for Africans.
Nearly 5 decades have passed since the last colonial footprint left the African continent. Yet, the CFA franc remains, a symbolic chain weighing heavily on the monetary sovereignty of 14 African nations. De Gaulle left Africa with a legacy that has yet to be broken. The 4 operational principles of the CFA franc: fixed exchange rate, free movement of capital, unlimited convertibility, and a mandatory deposit of 50% of foreign exchange reserves into the French treasury. To uphold these principles, special operating accounts were set up within the French treasury. Currently, there are 3 such accounts corresponding to the 3 CFA franc zones. But we won't discuss Comoros here, as it's not the focus of this video. From a positive perspective, these 4 principles have maintained stability in the 2 economic regions, as reflected in low inflation rates. Take Benin as an example. For 16 years, it maintained an inflation rate of just 8%. Even from 1977 to 2015, the highest it ever reached was 38.5%. On average, the West African region has sustained an extraordinarily low inflation rate, 2.57% over 19 years. For Central Africa, the figure stands at 4.02%. Compared to countries that don't use the CFA franc, this currency clearly holds its value well. This also means that goods prices in the CFA franc region have remained far more stable than in other parts of Africa. But every coin has 2 sides. France has made the currency so rigid that African nations cannot respond flexibly to their own domestic economic realities. So, although these countries enjoyed initial stability and even development right after gaining independence, those using the CFA franc quickly suffered the consequences amid Africa's economic turmoil in the 1980s. For example, Côte d'Ivoire couldn't adjust its exchange rate to protect its economy. The results are clearly visible on this chart. The opposite happened in Ghana, a country with its own currency, which it could freely adjust. Yet, an inflexible exchange rate isn't even the worst of it. The fixed rate of 656 CFA francs to €1 is widely seen as unreasonably high. In other words, the CFA franc is overpriced. Economists suggest that if this currency were allowed to float according to Africa's market conditions, its value would likely drop significantly due to the continent's economic stagnation. An overvalued currency is a nightmare for exports. Imagine this. You want to sell a cake to your neighbor for 10 units of currency A. Your neighbor uses currency B. 10A can be exchanged for 20B, meaning your neighbor has to spend 20B to buy your cake. Now, a merchant sells a similar cake for 30 units of currency C, but 30C equals only 15B. In this situation, who do you think your neighbor will buy from? Obviously the merchant, because he only has to pay 15B. That's how international exchange rates work. The CFA franc's artificially high value makes goods from the 14 African countries uncompetitive compared to products from other regions. As a result, no one wants to buy their exports, except France. Paris is always ready to take in the unsold goods from the CFA franc community. It may be slightly more expensive than market rates, but in return, France secures an almost exclusive supply of raw materials from Africa. On the flip side, France can export its own goods to these regions at competitive prices. And who wouldn't want to buy cheap goods? That consumer mindset is exactly what has allowed French products to dominate these regions. Buying cheap may sound appealing, but for African countries, it's a death sentence for economic development. When cheap foreign products are readily available, there's little motivation to produce locally. As a result, the manufacturing sector in the CFA franc region can hardly grow. And that's still not the full story. For low and middle-income countries, foreign investment is the key to economic boom. But a currency with an inflated value ruins that dream. Take this example. A European businessman wants to buy a company in Benin for 1 billion CFA francs. At the official exchange rate set by Europe, he'd need to pay more than 1.5 million euros for the deal. But if African countries could assess their own economic health and set a fair value for the CFA franc, say 1,312 francs per euro, then the businessman would only have to spend around 762,000 euros. That's nearly half the cost. The CFA franc's irrationally high value discourages foreign investors. Even local entrepreneurs in these 14 African countries are disinterested in investing at home. So where does their money go instead? Let's consider a few factors. Their investment currency is the CFA franc, which is pegged to the euro. So naturally, Europe becomes their most viable investment destination. But where in Europe can they invest when the continent is bogged down by countless strict regulations? Once again, France had the answer. Because of the agreement on free capital movement between France and the CFA franc zone, investors on both sides no longer had to worry about such barriers. The fixed exchange rate also reassures them about their returns, since it's not affected by floating currency fluctuations. Meanwhile, France is also free to invest in the CFA franc region. And this is exactly how the 14 African countries lost everything. Not only were they unable to diversify their sources of investment, they also suffered from capital flight, with their own money flowing out of the region. France emerged victorious again. Riding that momentum, Paris delivered a final blow to the CFA franc economies. According to the CFA system, all 14 African countries must deposit part of their foreign reserves into the French treasury. Originally, this amount was 100%. Over time, it was reduced to 65%. And finally, since 2005, they've been required to deposit 50% of their reserves with Paris. The Élysée Palace explains that this is to guarantee the convertibility of the CFA franc to the euro. Beyond the 50%, the 14 African countries must also contribute another 20% in the form of financial liabilities. That means they only retain control over 30% of their foreign reserves. Even worse, they can only withdraw these reserves within limits defined by the French treasury. This is a clear violation of monetary sovereignty. Foreign reserves are a critical resource used to implement sound monetary policies, like stabilizing exchange rates or controlling inflation. With 70% of the reserves of 14 countries effectively in French hands, France has enormous power over them. And no one knows exactly how France uses that money, because Paris never discloses its actions, not even to the countries in the CFA zone themselves. So, without colonial whips, France still manages to bind vast swaths of Africa to its sphere of influence. In return, 10 of these 14 countries now rank among the least developed nations in the world. But as the old saying goes, the needle hidden in the sack will eventually poke out. In 2019, Italian Deputy Prime Minister Luigi Di Maio publicly criticized French President Emmanuel Macron over the CFA franc. He even called on the European Union to sanction France for impoverishing Africa and forcing its people to migrate in search of a better life. He declared, "If not for Africa, France would only be the 15th largest economy in the world." And so today, France's mission isn't just to maintain the CFA franc system in Africa, but also to bury it once again under a shroud of international indifference. Now, let's return to Emmanuel Macron. The first French president born after the colonial era is now struggling to deal with the chaos that colonialism left behind.
It's not an African currency, so we consider it a Nazi currency imposed by our colonizers.
Patrice Talon has made the first move demanding the end of the decades-old colonial French agreement.
With a reputation as someone who once denounced colonialism as a crime against humanity,
c'est un crime. C'est un crime contre l'humanité, c'est une vraie barbarie. Et ça fait partie de ce passé que nous devons regarder en face, en présentant aussi nos excuses à l'égard de celles et ceux vers lesquels nous avons commis ces gestes.
Macron had to act, not only to salvage his own image, but also to preserve France's legacy on the African continent. From moral declarations
n'a aucun privilège à avoir. Elle n'a qu'à aider.
To tangible moves. Do you remember the footage at the beginning of this video? That handshake marked the beginning of a historic shift in the CFA franc region. 3 key reforms were announced. But take note, these changes only apply to West Africa. As for Central Africa, better luck next time. Still, the reforms have been greeted with cautious optimism in West African countries. But the joy was short-lived, as these changes were largely superficial. Although the CFA franc is being rebranded with a friendlier name, its essence remains unchanged. The new eco-currency is still pegged to the euro at a fixed rate. This means the West African Central Bank cannot independently adjust the currency's value. Paris also plans to transfer the printing rights of the eco to the West African Central Bank. But this is mostly nominal, because if they print more money, the eco's value would fall, breaking the fixed exchange rate with the euro. So, even in the most dire economic conditions, they will still have to follow Macron's directives. The most anticipated change is that Paris will no longer hold 50% of West Africa's foreign reserves. They will have more autonomy in managing foreign currencies and accessing IMF bailout loans. However, France still retains the right to supervise these reserves and provide final emergency assistance if needed. The scenario of Africa having true monetary freedom sounds beautiful, but sadly, it is yet to happen. Macron has tried to show his ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity, but that is still not enough. Voices simmering in Africa continue to rise day by day, claiming they need their own currency. They must genuinely feel independent politically, ideologically, and economically. Therefore, looking at Africa's case, we understand the true value of standing up and reclaiming independence. Even if blood is shed, even if money is lost, that is a necessary historical sacrifice. A sacrifice that can bring long-term self-reliance and strength to the nation.